1948, the advantages and disadvantages of the Marshall Plan. Originally known as the European Recovery Program, the Marshall Plan became widely known, being named after U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall. The Marshall Plan was deemed especially important for two main reasons. One, economic instability in Europe could possibly create political instability, allowing for communist revolutions. Second, the future of U.S. trading was dependent on Europe being productive and prosperous. European delegates drafted a reconstruction plan requiring $22 billion. President Truman lowered the amount to $17 billion and sent the draft legislation to Congress in 1948. Isolationists in Congress were opposed to the Marshall Plan because they believed by helping the Europeans they would be creating competition between industries. Others in the left wing condemned the plan, stating that it would only strengthen American capitalism in Western Europe. However, the Marshall Plan was approved and an initial payment of $5.3 billion was authorized in April 1948. The main positive outcome of the Marshall Plan was that it facilitated the recovery of Europe's national economies, but also had significant advantages for the U.S. Along with the rebuilding of Europe, the economy was now based on open markets and free trade, instead of protectionism and self-interest. Down the line, this allowed American exporters to enter European markets more easily than before World War II. However, not everything nor everyone favored the Marshall Plan. During the 1960s and 1970s, historians argued about the intention of the plan. Walter Lefebvre was one of them who argued that the plan wasn't to help Europe, but was a plan for the U.S. to gain much more control in Western Europe. Also, along with the opposition of the Marshall Plan, many Americans believed there was too much money being dumped into Europe. By the time of the Korean War in 1953, the Marshall Plan had been forced to stop, and countries that received funds from the U.S. did not have to repay the amount. Only 5% of the money was returned from all involved countries, covering only the administrative costs of the plan's implementation. U.S. advantages and disadvantages of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis, otherwise known as the Missile Scare, the October Crisis, and the Caribbean Crisis, is infamous to this day. The event was a 13-day confrontation between the U.S. and the Soviet Union initiated by the discovery of Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles based in Cuba. The base was a massive threat to the U.S. because the Soviets were now in reasonable rage to send rockets and attack U.S. land. The building of the missile sites in Cuba was discovered by a United States U-2 pilot. Nikita Khrushchev was secretly building these sites to counter the United States' growing lead in development and deployment of intermediate-range nuclear missiles. The discovery led to some positive and negative outcomes for the U.S. Since the site was discovered, the Soviet Union no longer had an advantage over the U.S. in terms of the ability to send missiles so easily. President Kennedy was responsible for a blockade that was out in place around Cuba, not allowing military supplies to be brought in. He also ordered the missile sites to be destroyed. The peaceful negotiation allowed the USSR and U.S. to go on about their business without causing nuclear war. So in the end, the whole Cuban Missile Crisis seemed to have a happy, positive ending. However, there was a negative outcome from the crisis. Even though the missiles were removed from Cuba, the Soviet Union remained in Cuba where it was kept as a communistic and highly armed area. The missiles were removed under UN supervision, but did not change the threat of a hostile area so close to the U.S. 1956. Nikita Khrushchev denounces Stalin for killing and jailing Soviet citizens. Nikita Khrushchev grew up in a small Russian village near the Ukrainian border. At the age of 14, he moved with his family to a Ukrainian mining town where he carried out odd jobs. Although he had a religious upbringing, Khrushchev joined the Communist Bolsheviks in 1918. In 1929, he moved to Moscow, where he began rising through the Communist Party ranks. Eventually, he was part of the inner circle around Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator at the time. During World War II, Khrushchev mobilized troops to fight Nazi Germany in Stalingrad and the Ukraine. He also helped rebuild the countryside and stifle Ukrainian nationalist dissent. When Stalin died in 1953, Khrushchev was positioning himself as a possible successor. Only 6 months later, he was announced head of the Communist Party. At first, Khrushchev, along with other high-ranking officials, ran a collective leadership. This changed when he ousted Premier Georgy Malenkov and replaced him with his ally Nikolai Bulganin. Khrushchev also foiled a Malenkov-led coup and took over the premiership the following March. Although Khrushchev was once a loyal Stalinist, he gave a long speech in February 1956 denouncing Stalin and his actions of arresting and deporting opponents. This address was intended to remain secret, but the full text ended up being released by the U.S. State Department. There were positive and negative outcomes of this address. A negative outcome included the protests in Poland and Hungary. Fortunately, the protest in Poland was solved peacefully. However, the Hungarian revolt ended in at least 2,500 Hungarians dead and 13,000 more were wounded. Also, many ended up flooding west, and others who were caught were arrested and deported. On the positive side, Khrushchev worked to increase agricultural production and to raise living standards. He also managed to reduce the power of the Soviet Union's feared police, releasing many political prisoners, relaxing artistic censorship, opening up the country to more foreign visitors, and he inaugurated the space age, launching the famed satellite Sputnik in 1957. 1950, Stalin and Mao signed the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance. The signing of the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance was a huge positive for the People's Republic of China, or the PRC. The treaty signing was conducted between Joseph Stalin and Foreign Minister Andrei Vyshinsky of the Soviet Union and Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai of the PRC. The terms of the treaty included that the Soviet Union must provide a $300 million credit to the PRC. Also, it mandated that the Soviet Union return the control of a major railroad and the cities of Port Arthur and Darien in Manchuria, which were taken near the end of World War II by the Soviet Union. I see this as a negative outcome of the treaty for the Soviet Union. They are required to pay back money and give up land that they had seized previously. The positive outcomes of this treaty for the USSR is that there would not be any future aggression from Japan or any associates of Japan. In this treaty, the PRC definitely came out on top because they got land and money back along with the promise of no war. However, the USSR only received the promise of no war and nothing else. Overall, the USSR was able to maintain peace, which was a positive, but lost land and money, a negative.